Dear beloved Sangha, it's such a joy to be together with all of you. As you were joining the talk this evening, I was enjoying so much sitting and seeing your smiling and peaceful faces and touching into the beautiful energy of the Compassionate Ocean Sangha. As I sit here, we're surrounded by the beautiful autumn leaves that are changing colors. Almost it seems every single hour through the day. It's such a beautiful time of the year, and we're surrounded with such beauty and such nourishment, and it's such a pleasure it being surrounded by such beauty and such nourishment to sit together with this beloved Sangha. Earlier this month, our brothers traveled to Brisbane, and I had the opportunity to visit the temple that I practiced in and that actually raised money to send me to Plum Village. It was so deeply moving to have a chance to walk on that land 27 years later. 27 years ago, it was a very small temple. It had an army barracks for a meditation hall, and there was one other building, which was another army barracks, which was where I stayed. The second army barracks is still there, and it's where the monk, there's one monk who's taking care of that temple now lives. But the rest of the temple has become a very large and very beautiful temple. It, as I shared, it was such a simple place where I needed to work with the weed whacker, the whippersnipper, and it was just bush and a couple of army barracks. Now, being a large and beautiful temple, there's in front of the place where the small army barracks, which was the Buddha hall, used to be. There used to be a very small Bodhi tree. It was not much more than a sapling. And I used to help take care of that Bodhi tree, watering it most days and keeping an eye on it, giving it a little bit of loving kindness. And now that tree has grown really, really large. When we came to the temple, it was such a beautiful and moving experience to walk under the branches of that very large, the now very large Bodhi tree, and to see how much it's grown and how much shade it's now offering. I had this feeling that somehow, in a funny kind of way, it still remembered me. We spent a lot of beautiful time together. I was remembering as I was walking around that temple and sharing with Brother Ben Min, Brother Ben Yak, and Brother Hong Bang, where different things were and the different jobs I used to do around the temple and some stories of those times. I was remembering myself as a young aspirant, a young practitioner. It was a very beautiful experience to come back to a place that in many ways gave me the chance to pursue my deepest aspiration. In the back of the shrine hall is an ancestral hall, and there are now pictures of some of the people that sent me to Plum Village on the walls of the ancestral hall. They've since passed over. So I had time to offer them all a stick of incense and to be able to bring back some beautiful memories of the times that we spent together. Some of the people that were my age my age now when I was in the temple are now quite a bit older. They're in their late 60s or early 70s. And so it was a very beautiful experience to come back and to really touch into the gratitude and the kindness that all of those people showed me. I remember in the shrine hall also, there's the ashes of the Venerable Sister who I first met. She was the abbess of that temple, that monastery when I first came. Her name was Yilfa. It means wonderful Dharma, Nyalfa, wonderful Dharma. She was quite elderly at that stage, but she was a real bodhisattva. and I was moved to tears to come before her ashes and to see the pictures of her, and also to hear the stories that the now abbot of that monastery has compiled about her life. Um, I was really lucky to have met a real bodhisattva in her. One of the defining characteristics of the Mahayana, or the great vehicle tradition, is both the emphasis on, and in a way, the democratization of the bodhisattva ideal. Previously, the term bodhisattva was used to refer mainly to the Buddha prior to his enlightenment. And there was a sense that a Buddha was a rare occurrence, and only one Buddha could occur at one time. In the Mahayana tradition, the great vehicle tradition, a bodhisattva is someone who's given rise to bodhicitta, the mind of love, and seeing that their own practice and the situation of the world around them is deeply interconnected. They have an aspiration to be liberated together with everyone and everything, to not leave anyone or anything behind. I sometimes take time to reflect on qualities that I feel are essential qualities of the spiritual life. And I keep coming back again and again to the view that one of the key factors of the path, or key factors of spiritual life, is this energy of aspiration. Back in around the year 2000, Tay wrote me a letter. And this wasn't that unusual for that period in time. Occasionally, we would all receive handwritten letters from Tay when he wanted to share something with us. And like all of Tay's letters, it was handwritten on a folded A4 piece of paper. That's 8.5 by 11 for those of us here in the States, piece of paper. And it was signed, "For my child, love and trust, Tay." I kept it close for a very long time. It's still on my bookshelf in Deer Park Monastery, so I'm looking forward to having a chance to be able to retrieve that letter. But I do have a picture of it, which I might post up in our Compassionate Ocean Sangha group for you to have a look at. The letter begins with Tay writing, "It's always my happiness to know that you're practicing and consolidating the brotherhood in the Sangha. It's the most meaningful thing to do. Sangha building is what makes the Buddha happy the most, because a happy and harmonious Sangha is the refuge for so many people. Each look, each word, each gesture, and each smile is a brick for Sangha building. Tay always trusts your intelligence. Helping to build the Sangha is something that makes Tay happy the most." Now, Tay's letter is a letter from a kind spiritual friend. And it's one of the things that nourishes me in difficult moments when other things can't. Around the same time that Tay wrote me that letter, around about the year 2000, Tay also made a suggestion to the monastic Sangha that we each write a love letter to ourselves. A letter that reminds us of our heart's deepest longing, the longing that brought us to the practice and that we should keep nearby to use in challenging times. Speaking for myself, I don't know about you, but I didn't wake up one morning and see my path laid out before me like a yellow brick road. Wouldn't that be great? Rather, I opened the door to the dull, secret ache in my heart, and I learned how to listen. As we've discussed before, in the Vietnamese language, we don't say, "I smelled the incense." We say, "I heard the incense," or we don't say, "I smelled the rose," or "Doesn't the rose smell beautiful," or something. We say, "I heard the fragrance of the rose." Isn't that an amazing way of experiencing our senses? To listen with our nose, to listen with our eyes, to listen with our whole body. when we call upon the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, she who listens to the cries of the world, the energy of this Bodhisattva is not an energy that's just listening with the ears, but this is the energy of listening with every cell of our being, listening with our whole body. Opening a space to listen to me is both the heart and the secret of meditation. So I began to listen to that ache in my heart, not only with my ears, but with my whole body. And I discovered that in some way it was calling me to service, to openness, and to being as available as possible. And really that was scary because it meant giving up my idea of everything that I'd known up to then, everything that I'd accomplished. Admittedly, it wasn't much, it still isn't, and who I was to become. You know, I've got a lot of compassion for myself as a young aspirant. And I think some of the tears that I had when I visited the temple that I was practicing in were out of compassion for that young aspirant. And there are moments in meditation or moments in my practice life when time seems a little less linear somehow. And it can feel as if I'm sitting next to my younger self as a wiser, hopefully, elder brother. And I've got my arm around that young aspirant's shoulder and I'm saying, it's going to be okay. This is who you're going to be in 27 years, for better or worse. And I consider the fact that I arrived in Plum Village a miracle. It was never planned. The best things in life rarely are. I'd returned to Australia from Sri Lanka, where I'd practiced meditation in the forest tradition for a number of months. And I was at a crossroads to go back to my job, which was waiting for me, or to continue my spiritual journey. And I wrestled for quite a long time. What a difficult decision to make. And I remember picking up the phone book, though. I mean, this is something that we don't do these days anymore. We don't really pick up the phone book, but I picked up the phone book and I think it was in the yellow pages. And I found the Vietnamese Queensland Buddhist Association. And so we didn't have anything like Google Maps or anything back then. So I didn't really know which station to get off, but I wrote down the address of the temple on a small sheet of paper. And I got off at a station which was about 8 kilometers from the temple. And I walked in 40-degree heat those 8 kilometers, maybe 5 miles or something, to this small temple that I've already described. And I walked into that army barracks, which was the Buddha Hall, and I knelt on the floor of the Buddha Hall, which was abandoned, like kind of nobody was in there at that moment. And after about half an hour, an old Vietnamese nun came out and she was shocked to see me. I spoke no Vietnamese and she didn't speak any English. She also had, she was actually quite deaf and she had hearing aids. But somehow within a very short period of time, I was living in a traditional Vietnamese Pure Land temple, inviting the bell during the Sunday service in honor of the Buddha Amitabha, and driving the temple bus to pick up the older parishioners. And those are the people that, from the kindness of their heart, raised money to send me to Plum Village. Actually, I should probably say that the community was a bit divided. Half of them actually wanted to send me to Canada, under the Most Venerable Thích Tâm Châu, who's the head of the Vietnamese Buddhist Association in the West. And the other half wanted to send me to Plum Village. And I don't know exactly what happened, how the half of the community that decided to send me to Plum Village was the community that prevailed, but that's what happened. I could have just as easily been sent to Canada, but I was sent to Plum Village, and the rest, as they say, is history. And I guess I'll save it for another time. But the funny thing with aspiration is that to me, it's not a static thing. Just like we ourselves, it's always changing, always growing. It has a continuity, but it's always developing. And to me, that's as it should be. Just like any relationship, we need to rediscover and renew our commitment many times a day, not only once in a ceremony many years in the past. Aspiration gives shape, direction, and definition to our path. Imagining the flow of inspiration, the flow of aspiration as a river. Aspiration's both the banks of the river and the current itself, helping things to move forward. Otherwise, the water is just a stagnant pool. And this is never easy. There have been times, too numerous to count, when I felt I couldn't take another step. And then somehow I did. Because fundamentally, I don't want to live the dream. A dream is always something that I can never quite get to realize. I want to live the reality. I want ground under my feet, not something hazy in the near or distant future. Even if, or perhaps especially if, it means that I need to allow myself to experience discomfort, to experience confusion and disappointment. In some ways, these can also be wonderful friends on the path of spiritual discovery. I can honestly say that I've got a lot of gratitude for the difficulties that I've faced. Each and every one of them have brought me to this moment, to this place, to the very good conditions that we enjoy here. I don't think I could have said this maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but I can honestly say that I wouldn't trade them for anything. For me, what touches me the most practicing here in Mountain Spring is that I see this deep aspiration, this deep longing to serve and to heal the world in the people that come to practice here, the people that I come into contact with. I see open hearts. I see deep courage. And so for me, that gives me a lot of inspiration, and I feel hopeful about our world. I don't feel in despair about the situation of the world because I see that brightness, that light, that engagement in those who come here. And for me, that's a great good fortune, and I feel so privileged. In Buddhism, it says that the kind of people that manifest in our lives, the kind of environment that manifests in our life is a reflection of the kind of seeds, the causes and conditions that we've planted in the past and in the present. So increasingly, although things are challenging, I think that I might have planted a couple of good seeds to be able to be in contact with so many wonderful people, people who choose to look deeply, to live from their hearts, and to be fiercely honest and transparent within the moment. And one of the most beautiful manifestations of aspiration, the most beautiful manifestation of this energy that we sometimes call vow or vow power in the Mahayana tradition are what we call the four great vows. In some way, these vows are deep, paradoxical vows. They, in some way, with our logical mind, they can never be attained, and yet we make these vows. Both of the formulations of these vows, one of which will be quite familiar to many of us. Both of these formulations were generated by the great teacher of the Tiantai school that we met in previous talks, Master Zhi Yi. And the second one can be found in the Chinese version of the Lotus Sutra. So the four vows are like this: living beings are limitless. I will rescue them all. Afflictions are limitless. I will transform them all. Dharma doors are limitless. I will enter them all. The Buddha's way is unattainable, so I will attain it. And in many temples, this is either calligraphed somewhere or it's chanted and recited every day. These are very well known throughout the Northern Buddhist tradition. The second version of the Four Great Vows I also find very beautiful, and in some ways it often touches my heart a little more. Perhaps because, although I love the first version, perhaps I may have chanted it quite a lot of times in the early part of my spiritual life. So sometimes when I hear it, a part of me kind of goes into recitation mode. And the second part really strikes me very deeply. The second version, which is, as I said, comes from the Chinese version of the Lotus Sutra, reads, "Those who have not yet been ferried over, I will ferry over. Those who have not yet understood, I will cause to understand. Those who have not yet settled themselves, I will cause them to be settled. Those who have not attained liberation, I will give them causes to be liberated." I had a wonderful friend who has roots from Jamaica. She has two young boys, and she lives in Arizona in the United States now with her husband. And when she came to visit me in Deer Park Monastery, she brought her two young boys, and at the time they were about 9 or 10 years old, and they had a lot of energy. And at one point, she turned to them and she said, "You both need to cease and settle." And so when I read this third vow about those who have not yet settled themselves, I will cause them to be settled, she always comes to mind. She shared with me that that phrase, "cease and settle," is a phrase that they use a lot in Jamaica, although I've never been there myself. But I like it. Those who have not yet settled themselves, I will cause them to settle. The four great vows, the fundamental vows of a bodhisattva, have been seen by great teachers as a reinterpretation of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are, of course, the core teachings of Buddhism. And everything in Buddhism, all the insights of Buddhism, emerge from the hub, if you like, the core of these four insights. Every practice, every teaching in Buddhism is an expansion of the Four Noble Truths. And the great teachers have shared with us that these four vows are a Mahayana reinterpretation. So the Four Noble Truths are that there is dukkha, there's suffering, there's unsatisfactoriness in life. That this dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness has a cause, and that it can be transformed, and that there's a path to transform suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. And the four Mahayana vows are the commitments of a bodhisattva, which is a person who practices to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of everyone. They're a reinterpretation of the Four Noble Truths in a sense that they express the same principles in a more dynamic and expansive way. They also reflect the spirit of Mahayana Buddhism, which is characterized by compassion, wisdom, and skillful means. Many years ago, I was gifted a book by my 5 mindfulness trainings teacher, the Most Venerable Master Xing Yun. And the book was called Perfectly Willing. When I hear the title of this chapter, the chapter of the Lotus Sutra that we're going to be looking at this evening and over the course of this month, which is called Willing Acceptance, I'm reminded of this book, Perfectly Willing, which was given to me, because in that book, we're taught that the path of a practitioner is a path of being perfectly willing to embrace with both arms whatever comes their way. The 4th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, as I just mentioned, is called Willing Acceptance. And in this chapter, we discover another of the Lotus Sutra's 7 famous parables. And the title, Willing Acceptance, shows us the main teaching that's offered to us through this very well-known and beautiful parable. The chapter itself begins with 4 of the senior disciples Mahakashyapa, Subhuti, Mahakachayana, and Moggallana, praising the Buddha for his profound wisdom and compassion. They expressed their joy and their confidence on hearing the Buddha's revelation that he attained enlightenment countless eons ago, and that he's been using various expedient means, various skillful means to teach us, teach living beings according to our needs and our potential. They also acknowledge that they've been attached to provisional teachings, the teachings of the three vehicles, and haven't realized the true nature of all phenomena, which is the essence of the Lotus Sutra. So in the beginning of this chapter, again, we have this energy of joy, this energy of joyful embrace. And as we've shared in previous talks, this is one of the main themes of the Lotus Sutra, that upon hearing this teaching, this energy of rejoicing, whenever we come into contact with a teaching that touches our heart, to rejoice. Whenever we have the opportunity, this month in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, we're continuing to study the Discourse on Happiness, which has 38 blessings, 38 auspicious signs that we can look out for to see that actually we have many blessings in our life and we're a very lucky person. So if we come into contact with any one of those 38 signs, being in regular contact with monks and nuns, being able to practice the Dharma, being able to have Dharma discussion, and so on, then we give rise to this energy of rejoicing. This is something that is a beautiful characteristic of the path. These great elders in the Lotus Sutra then tell a parable to illustrate their understanding of the Buddha's teaching. The story goes a little bit like this. The parable is about a poor son who ran away from his wealthy father when he was young, and he wandered around for quite a long time. We might like to imagine about 20 years, and he was living in poverty and hardship. Meanwhile, his father searched for him everywhere, and the father eventually settled in a big city, a city different from the place that he was living when the son was living with him. And the father became rich and powerful. And one day, by chance, the son arrived in that city and he saw his father's mansion, but he didn't recognize him as his father. Time had passed, circumstances had passed. He felt intimidated by his father's grandeur and prestige, and so he decided to run away. However, his father recognized him. He recognized that this was his son, and he sent his servants to bring the son back to him. And the son was terrified, and he thought he was being arrested for some crime. And having that feeling of terror, he fainted on the spot. The father realized through this that the son just wasn't ready to accept his true identity and inheritance. And so he used a skillful means to gradually win his trust and win his confidence. He ordered his servants to release his son and tell him that he was hired as a worker to remove dirt and dung from the mansion. The son was really relieved and he happily accepted the job. The father then disguised himself as an old and shabby worker and over time got closer and befriended the son. He praised his son's diligence and created causes and conditions for the son to be given better clothes, better conditions, and more wages. He also entrusted him with more responsibilities and authority over his household affairs. And after 20 years, the son became familiar with his father's business, and he gained his respect and his affection. And at one point, the father became very ill and began to realize that he was going to die soon. So he called his son and all the relatives, friends, and officials and his servants to his bedside. And he then reveals to them that this worker is actually his long lost son, whom he's been looking for many years. He also declared that he would give all his wealth and property to his son as his sole heir. The son was astonished and overjoyed by this revelation. He realized that his father had been compassionate and wise in guiding him step by step from this lowly position into a high status. He also felt grateful and maybe a little repentant for his ignorance and foolishness in leaving his father in the first place. And the parable ends with the 4 senior disciples explaining its meaning to the assembly. They share with us that the rich father represents the Buddha, who has attained supreme enlightenment. And that's not only been a few years ago, but since time immemorial, and has so much merit and virtue. And this is an important point. In fact, one of the key themes of the Lotus Sutra, one of the themes is the universal aspect of Buddha nature. And then the fact that there's only one vehicle. And also another key theme is what we call the infinite lifespan of the Buddha. The infinite lifespan and the immanent nature of Buddhahood. In some way, each Buddha is an emanation of a quality that's always available. I guess you could say a kind of universal principle. Up until now, there was not this sense. In a somewhat simplified way, we might like to say that in the Theravadan view, Buddhahood is something that we practice and struggle to attain. And this process might take many lifetimes over many eons. In the Mahayana view, most particularly in the Lotus Sutra, Buddhahood is seen as being a universal principle, always available, that sometimes manifests in human form. The concept of the infinite lifespan of the Buddha in the Lotus Sutra is one of the most profound and revolutionary teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. It reveals that the Buddha is not only a historical figure who lived and died 2,666 years ago, but a timeless and eternal reality that pervades all existence. In fact, in chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra, the lifespan of the thus come one, the lifespan of the Tathagata. Tathagata means life, means thus come one, the one who's come from suchness, which we'll delve into later on. This theme is introduced in some detail and discussed in some detail. The Buddha says in the text, my lifespan is an immeasurable number of asamkhya kalpas. And during that time, I've constantly abided here without ever entering extinction. Good people, originally I practiced the Bodhisattva way, and the lifespan that I acquired then has yet to come to an end, but will last twice the number of years that have already passed. And this statement, understandably, shocks and astonishes his listeners. They can't understand how the Buddha could have such a long lifespan. He looks only about 60, let's say, at this stage. By the way, the other day I had a visitor who looked about 50. At the end of his visit, he shared that he's actually 74. He doesn't seem to have any wrinkles or gray hairs. So we can make some allowances for sure, but 20 years is not the same as an incalculable kalpa. One kalpa, let alone a whole series of them here, is described as the time it would take for a mountain like Mount Everest to wear away if once every 100 years a person climbed up the mountain with a silk cloth and let the silk cloth brush gently across the summit just once, just lightly and just once, and then went back down the mountain, and after another 100 years went up and did that again. That a kalpa would last about the time it would take for that whole mountain to wear away just from that gentle brush of silk. So basically a long time. He then explains that he attained enlightenment countless kalpas ago, far beyond any calculation, and that he's been manifesting himself in various forms and various worlds to teach and save all living beings. He also says, and this is an important point, that he only appears to enter nirvana as a skillful means, an upaya, to inspire people to seek the Dharma. But in reality, he's never gone anywhere. The title of the Buddha, Tathagata, means the one who comes and goes in perfect suchness. It means that we can't comprehend this with our intellectual mind. He assures us that he's always present in the world, and that anyone who sincerely practices his teachings can see him and hear him. I guess we could say a kalpa in Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist cosmology is a unit of time that's equivalent to billions of years in human terms. And an asamkha is even longer, beyond calculation. A Buddha's lifespan is so vast that it transcends time and space. And this is the key point here. We're so limited with our view of time and our view of space. And so here we are receiving a teaching that's what we call in Plum Village an ultimate dimension teaching, outside of time, outside of space. And that he's been teaching the Dharma in various forms and manifestations throughout the universe. He explains that he's only appeared to be born, only appeared to attain enlightenment and enter nirvana as a skillful means to inspire us of our own capacity to walk on the path of Buddhahood, on the path of awakening. So the implication of this teaching is that the Buddha is not a separate or distant being, but the very essence of life itself. Every morning in this meditation hall and in meditation halls belonging to the Plum Village tradition around the world, we begin our day. The first words spoken are not actually words that are spoken in the monastery. They're sung, they're chanted. We practice noble silence in the evenings, and we come into the meditation hall still in noble silence, but the very first vocal sounds that break that silence are the morning chant. And in that morning chant, we begin with the Dhammakaya, the Dhamma body is bringing morning light. And here in this teaching, we are understanding that the Buddha himself is the Dhammakaya, the ultimate reality, and it transcends all forms and phenomena, as well as the other manifestation of the Buddha, which is Nirmanakaya, which this is the kind of capacity to adapt to the needs and capacities of living beings, and also the Sambhogakaya, the wisdom body. And it reveals the true aspect of all beings. And we've talked about these three bodies of the Buddha in the past: the Dhamma body, the bliss body, and the retribution body. Retribution body, we could say, is our physical body. I know my body feels a little bit like a retribution body quite often. And then we have our Dhamma body and our transformation body, our bliss body, our happiness body. I remember once when Tay came back, he flew to Washington, D.C. for an AIDS conference. I think it was in the year 2000. Perhaps it was 99 or 2000. He came back to Plum Village. He was just in Washington, D.C. for 4 days. And coming back, he was quite tired. So he put on a Dharma talk. And he said he was watching himself give a Dharma talk. And at the end of the Dharma talk on video, he said to everybody, the retribution of Tay is watching the transformation body of Tay give a Dharma talk. So sometimes it's a little bit like that. The Lotus Sutra teaches that all living beings have the potential to become Buddhas because we inherently possess those same characteristics. That if we understand deeply the interbeing nature of all phenomena, that we ourselves also contain and are part of what's just been described, the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body. So we share that same nature. There's no, in this view of the Lotus Sutra, there's no separation. This is one aspect of what's called Buddha nature. So the concept of the infinite lifespan of the Buddha and the teaching in the Lotus Sutra that the birth and death of a Buddha are also skillful means challenges our usual view of birth and death and offers a new perspective. Since there's a bit of a delusion in Buddhism or our way of thinking about awakening, because we tend to think of, when we think of awakening, even though we give a lot of lip service to interbeing and we nod our heads sagely with this wisdom of us being part of the Dharmakaya and the Buddha body, but we still think about a person who's becoming awakened. I practice to become awakened. I will wake up to my situation. And we think of the Buddha also as a person who became awakened. If in Buddhism we have the insight of no self, anatta, or interbeing, then please show me right here and right now what it is that awakens. It will be very helpful for us later on to spend some time, once we've had our journey through this remarkable realm of the Lotus Sutra, to spend some time with the Diamond Sutra that goes deeply into how our concepts of a self, a living being, a person, and a lifespan can hinder our understanding of the compassionate wisdom, the insight of the Buddha. This parable of I guess you could call the prodigal son or the lost son, reminds us also of our tendency to doubt our own capacity. It also reminds us that living beings are like the son who's forgotten their true nature as Buddhas, and we wander around in samsara, this cycle of birth and death in ignorance and suffering. And we're being pulled this way and that, caught in our false identities. So, in a way, this parable invites us to awaken to this understanding that we're never separated from the Buddha's wisdom and compassion. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. In one of our earlier talks on the Lotus Sutra, we were introduced to the Tiantai school of Buddhist thought and the great Tiantai master Zhi. We also touched briefly on the teaching of the 5 periods of teaching that was developed within the Tiantai lineage. In fact, the 5 classifications, which most likely don't fully correspond to historical reality, the reality in this historical realm, are actually incredibly useful in terms of a systemization of the Buddha's teaching. And I at least feel it's a remarkable achievement. And these classifications that we discussed in one of the earlier talks, these 5 periods of classification, are actually very much connected to and emerge from this parable. So in addition to uh, reminding us of our own innate nature, this parable has given rise to a classification of the Buddhist scriptures that many find to be really quite amazing. So, as we shared in previous talks, according to the fivefold classification, the Avatamsaka Sutra was the first sutra that the Buddha taught immediately after his enlightenment. And when he offered that teaching, I guess you could say everybody just stared at him and their jaws dropped. They didn't get it at all. So, according to this classification, since nobody could understand what on earth the Buddha was talking about, that he realized he needed to backtrack. He needed to, I guess you could say, come down to the acoustic version of his teachings, come down to the core aspects of his teachings, begin from the very beginning. And according to this classification, for 20 years, he taught what we recognize today as the Pali Canon, the foundational teachings. And this period corresponds to the part of the parable in which the son is asked to sweep the manure for the father. In the third period of teaching, so the first period is the Avatamsaka period, the second period is the Pali Canon, the foundational period, and then the third period is the period called the Vaipuya period, where the Buddha began teaching the introductory Mahayana teachings. And this is like the son having free access to his father's house, but still remaining in his humble quarters. In the fourth period, the Buddha taught the Prajnaparamita sutras, the sutras like the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines, and so on, which are some of the higher forms of Mahayana insight on the balance between wisdom and emptiness or interbeing. And this corresponds to the man asking his impoverished son to take care of his fortune. Then in the final period, according to this 5 periods of classification, once again the Buddha reveals all. And this is represented by the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra. This in the parable relates to the father knowing that he's near death, publicly acknowledging his son and leaving all of his wealth to him. So moving on, one other aspect of the chapter that provides us with food for contemplation is the teaching that was championed by our friends in the Yogacara school of philosophy. They shared that there are 2 aspects to Buddha nature. Buddha nature as a universal principle or a suchness. And then there's also Buddhahood as an active or an activated energy. In one way, we might understand it as, on the one hand, Buddhahood as a universal capacity and possibility for everyone, but one that we need to cultivate at the same time. Tay shared about this when he shared that at this moment in time, we're part-time Buddhas, and that our work as a practitioner is to become full-time Buddhas by transforming the seeds in our consciousness. This reminds me of the beautiful verse by the great Zen master Dogen. Within the tree, there's a flower already. Within the rock, there's a spark. So within the tree, even in the depths of winter, and here in Mountain Spring, we're moving into winter, and a lot of the trees that have sprouted flowers in the spring now no longer have their leaves. But if we look deeply, we can already see within that tree a flower, but it needs conditions to manifest. In the same way, when we look at a rock, when you strike 2 rocks together, particularly rocks of a particular type, they give a spark. But that spark is dormant there without conditions to arise. But it still exists in some form in that rock already. It just needs the right conditions to manifest. Within the tree, there's the flower already. Within the rock, a spark. That potential of Buddhahood is already there. just needing the right causes and conditions to manifest. So these, dear community, are the few things that I wanted to share, wanted to invite us to hold in our hearts, in our consciousness over the next few weeks about this chapter 4 of the Lotus Sutra. This month, for our homework, my recommendation is that each one of us take time to write ourselves a love letter. This is a letter about your bodhicitta, that longing of your heart that set you on your spiritual path, on your spiritual journey. And we keep that letter and we read it in challenging moments to remind us of our bodhicitta, our deepest aspiration. So that's my invitation for you this month. I hope you'll find it helpful and useful. And I wish everyone a very beautiful and wonderful month of practice. It might even be a fun exercise, although they're very personal letters. We can see in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, if there are a few of us at some point in a be-in or in our sharing groups, we might want to share aspects of our love letter, because sharing that longing of the heart that brought us to the spiritual path with each other is so nourishing, it's so inspiring and so beautiful. So that might be something to consider. So dear friends, it's been a delight to sit together with you this evening. I hope you found something useful. Let us come to a close with 3 sounds of the bell.